Hey, it's nice to be here. Thanks to Sophie and Laura and Hanno and everybody at Democracy Lab for allowing what was a kind of a chance connection to turn into this. So at this point in most conferences, I'm going to sleep, and usually if you're going to sleep during your own talk, that's not a very good sign. But this has been so energized and interesting that I actually am going to bring in a piece from the earlier session I was at that involved how you can get people better in touch with their own emotional selves. And the piece I want to bring in is that I feel that we're living in the midst of multiple dysfunctional world systems. An environment that's killing species, an economy that doesn't work well for the environment or for most of the people who depend on an economy, and democracy that is somehow overrepresenting business at the expense of the majority of citizens. When I think about those systems, I get emotionally stressed. Okay, it produces stress, and I'm not sure we are aware enough of how stressful it is to live within dysfunctional systems that affect us in very personal ways. So when I feel that stress attack coming on, what I do is imagine a perfect world. So I'm going to invite you to a sort of a mindful moment, I guess they call it these days, to think about what your perfect set of world systems might look like. And here's mine. And it's actually similar to Maya's. And so it says that people who are thinking about the same things might actually come to the same images about what a better world would look like. The environment should be the big container that houses the other systems, and then society should live within the environment and actually control the government. How about that for a radical idea? And the government, answerable to society and the environment, should control the economy. I go to sleep happier at night when I think about this image of the possible world that we could live in. However, when I get stressed, I realize it's because the reality of our world is more like this. The economy is the biggest thing. That's what we hear the most about. And then government is trying to keep it propped up against increasing odds. And society sort of fits in depending on which society you live in or are fortunate enough to live in, either more or less of society fits into those systems, and then the environment is bringing up the small part. And this is personally very stressful for me. So I am here out of personal motivation to try and think about how this could be changed. So how did we get to this? Your version of this may look a little different than mine, but how did we get here? Well, in the 1970s, to make a long story short, Keynesianism stopped working for a variety of really interesting reasons that produced economic outcomes that were theoretically impossible. And when outcomes are theoretically impossible, paradigms often crash. Not always. Neoliberalism is still chugging along. But the neoliberals were waiting and had been organizing for such an opportunity for many years. At least since the end of World War II, they had been meeting, organizing, creating think tanks, cultivating politicians, ready to spread these super simple utopian, which have turned into dystopian ideas, and under the happy advertising slogan of free markets make for free people. Okay? These ideas are beginning to run out of credibility, but they are still in power. So my project, the question is, how might we remove these ideas from power and replace them with equally simple ideas that have a lot more credibility and effectiveness for how we live on the planet? So how did they do it? Well, they had the experts. They had opportunistic politicians. They had popular culture figures producing stories that millions of people read to reinforce the personal nature of this free markets, free people idea. And most importantly of all, they developed a global think tank network, which I guess we all know the progressive left cannot match. So the challenge that I'm going to share with you today is how can we, on the progressive left, develop thought networks that connect all the movements, all the different good projects together in ways that produce a set of shareable, simple, powerful ideas without the money. Okay, so that's our obstacle. We don't have the money. They had a ton of money, and they still do. So what did it look like? It was systemic. We're a far piece from this, but this is how they did it. Basically, these think tanks, public intellectuals who spread some of these ideas in very different circles, public journalism circles, academic circles, and then there were politicians. Pinochet did it at gunpoint. Chile is still a neoliberal country despite public opposition to those policies because it was inscribed in the Constitution and remains so to this day. And then there were business elites with just enough money to fund the think tanks and the meetings and the many gatherings. And then there were a number of economists, some of whom were branded with the Nobel Prize, which made all of this nonsense credible in the eyes of some. And then around this core network of neoliberalism were these others that were echoing these same basic, simple core ideas. So these are very dense networks that have a remarkable similarity in the fundamental ideas that they try to impose on society. Privatization of everything, markets unregulated by governments, government's role being to protect business contracts and business interests, and to create ever new creative kinds of finance that is destabilizing the world economy. So there was a crashing opportunity lost to a more sane and humane world in the 1970s. And it was lost to an idea that was never popular. Neoliberalism was never a popular idea. It was a movement by, of, and for elites. So it was an elite political and economic movement. In fact, what I would argue with you is that at the same time neoliberalism rose to hegemonic proportions, there was a global environmental justice movement that mobilized millions of people on the planet around a combination of ideas about the environment being sacred and limited and ideas about economics being important to keep in tune with that environment. These are the images from my youth, when I was the age of many people in this crowd. I went to bed with the Whole Earth catalog next to my nightstand, and Spaceship Earth became an iconic image that is still with us today, suggesting that we have a limited planet and we should figure out an economy that operates within those limits. The Club of Rome report was a huge bestseller. Economics books are seldom such bestsellers, but this one was. So there was an environmental movement with an economics attached, and it was pushed aside by essentially a neoliberal coup in nation after nation after nation. So, but the environmental movement didn't go away. They were still in the streets. They were far larger than the neoliberal movement ever was. They were still in the streets lobbying for some attention to the planet. And so the grand compromise, as Maya said earlier this morning in her talk, came in 1987 with this concept that the UN brokered for sustainable development. It was the great compromise. How do we have growth and environmental sustainability all at the same time? Turns out you can't. But it sounds good. We want it. We hope, we pray that this will work. It doesn't, and it won't. But we hope so because it sounds good. And it sounds so good that they renewed it again 2 years ago at the UN, and they promised in the Global South 7% growth rates. Yes, sir. They must have been on something. I don't know. But in any event, it's still what we've got. The result is that since growth, as we know it, is incompatible with the environment and its life support systems, we've got an oppositional problem. A systems problem, that dysfunctional systems problem that I talked about at the beginning that gives me a lot of stress. Even the promise of economic growth, however, turned out to be false. Not only was the environmental protection promise not kept from sustainable development, but the economic growth promise wasn't kept in many ways, producing chronic crisis. I mean, we live in a state of crisis now. Austerity is the norm. Inequality is growing. And business and government both have their own brands of austerity to offer to general publics, which has produced rising voter anger. So for the last couple of years, I've been looking at what has happened to that rising voter anger, and you all know the results, but actually they're pretty shocking and worrisome to me. That right now, at this moment, in European nations with 5 million or more people in them, there are now 17 radical right parties in parliament and 4 in government, and I think 5 as soon as Austria gets its government put together, so that number will go up. Meanwhile, there are 9 radical left parties and only 1 in Greece in government today. And by radical left and radical right, I mean parties beyond the Christian Democrats and the liberals and the Social Democrats and the Greens, okay? So the game is not even close. The right is winning, and the left is doing a lot of things, lots and lots and lots of things, except for voting. Very annoying. So how can groups working for economic, environmental, and social justice begin to develop and spread ideas that are better for people on the planet and, most importantly, make people on the left want to vote again for political parties that will implement those ideas? So that's the project that I'm going to share with you today. But I first want to address the big challenge. I mean, the neoliberalism was an easier sell because it was a very small movement of very wealthy people who had relatively common interests. The left today has many, many interests, many good interests that are often very localized. And the years of protest against neoliberalism, which has galvanized the left in many ways, produced the largest demonstrations in human history for year after year after year. I mean, that's impressive if you think about what is the left doing. Well, they're demonstrating in larger numbers than ever before in human history. But all of the diversity on the left requires a new sense of democracy. And that new sense of democracy, I think, is based in the idea of how do we bring our differences together and do some things together. Unfortunately, not voting, but do some things together, like protest. We have an emerging notion, culture, if you will, on the left of deliberative, direct, participatory democracy. And deliberation is wonderful, except that it doesn't scale well. And it doesn't work well with political parties and elections. Other than that, it's something to be celebrated because it does solve the diversity problem on the left. So this is, as I see it, the dilemma of the left today. My hope is that we can solve this dilemma by bringing ideas into many different realms of progressive politics, ideas that are as simple as the ideas that the neoliberals started with one exception: they actually would work better for people and for the planet. Other than that, we might want to think about keeping our ideas as simple as the neoliberals were, only make them true. And emotional, things people can feel when they get stressed out. So what are some lessons from neoliberalism that I can share with you as I was studying how it came into being? Simple ideas, and ideas that fit an opportunity, which I think we now have because we are in permanent crisis and people are angry and looking for solutions. The think tanks were huge for them. I can't tell you how important I think they were to produce those ideas and hand them out at every level of public life, from cities to states and Länder, to federal governments, and even to international trade organizations. So the think tanks were important, but we don't have the money, So what can we do instead of funding 500 progressive think tanks, like Progressive Zentrum here in Berlin? Well, maybe we want to get smart with technology and networking. The richness of networks in this room is amazing to me. So how can we hold on to the interesting ideas we've each taken from our conversations today and then begin having the kind of dialogue that begins to develop a shared set of narratives that have some emotional resonance to them? That's the challenge that I want to share with you. And then, once we connect all the movement networks, or at least enough of them, we don't need to connect all of them, that's not possible, but just enough of them, then we want to remember what many activists on the left seem to have forgotten, is that there was an historic relationship between movements and political parties. Movements discipline political parties. You all know the story of the labor movement and the labor parties. But that era is gone, or passing. It's not gone, but it's passing. So what kind of relationship can a better connected set of progressive movements begin to develop with political parties on the center and all the way to the far left? That's, I think, our challenge, and I would like us to work a little bit on how to meet that challenge. But here's the question, is what kinds of ideas can possibly unite the diversity of movements on the progressive left? And I could tell you what they are, but you wouldn't buy it. So why should I waste your time telling you what those ideas are, even though I'm pretty sure I know what they are? But that isn't the point. If we're going to actually network, there has to be a process so we arrive at those ideas together. That's where the thought network comes in. That's where the think tanks of our world need to happen, I think. So I suggest we start a set of dialogues around these questions. The big question is, how do we want to live? Everybody can engage with that, I'm pretty sure. And what's the environment for? Is it something to exploit and harvest and kill? Or is it something to use in a more respectful and life-sustaining way? What's the economy for? This set of spheres that I think we live in that stress me out, with the economy being the biggest sphere, it's like the economy is the overarching reality that none of us can quite touch or control. It's like the volcano, living at the foot of the volcano that could erupt any day, but we don't have control over it. It's removed from most people's lived experiences, other than in kind of distressing ways. So what's the economy for? How could it work better? People can have that conversation. I think anybody can have that conversation. And what kind of a democracy do we want? Do we want one that represents public interests, that actually represents voters? One of the reasons why people on the left are not voting is that they keep voting and not getting representation. And so they have lost confidence. There's a legitimacy crisis of left parties. And many of the parties on the right that are rising up are newer parties that people are creating out of movements and have much simpler ideas. So I propose that we create thought-action networks aimed at something like this kind of an outcome, and fill those networks with not just wonky ideas, facts, and reason, because facts and reason don't work so well these days, I've begun to notice, but have images and emotional connections for people. And so let's adapt the neoliberal model and develop networks of the sort everybody here is involved with in really interesting ways, and find ways to connect these networks to find, not to give up any of our stories, any of our missions, but to add a layer of meaning that we can join together to pressure political parties into different kinds of action. So we can remember movement tactics once we join more together around common ideas, movement tactics that have traditionally worked to discipline political parties and offer them votes if they adopt better ideas. So this is the project that I've come up with a number of colleagues, some of whom are here, Maria and Vicky. Is Vicky around somewhere? But yay. And a group of colleagues at Siegen and in Seattle, and I hope soon more in Berlin. And it's the idea of having a common set of narratives that actually address all of these big systems issues at the same time. But if they're simple, that's not too much to ask, if those ideas can be simple. So if we think about how to create economies that work better for people and the planet, and of course that entails democratic reform so that political parties and elections actually represent people, and perhaps the interests of the planet, future generations even, species that don't have votes, we might actually make some progress toward balancing that current imbalance between neoliberal power in the middle, the rising right-wing anti-democratic power, and our non-voting margin on the progressive left. So this is the project I invite you to visit. We actually wrote a manifesto. I mean, I guess you need a manifesto at some point when you're doing a project like this. So we have one. And I would be very interested in knowing what you think of our manifesto. And more important than what you think about it, if we work together in a network to bridge our differences by sharing powerful ideas, what ideas would each of you want to add to that manifesto to make it work better for you? And we are planning, as soon as Vicky gets a decision made about which site's going to work best for us, to put the manifesto up for some crowd editing and crowd input and see if we can begin a dialogue about those simple questions of how do we want to live, what's the environment for, what's the economy for, and how should democracy work? Thank you.